Welcome everyone to the Antonym session on Indian science fiction, its past, present, and the path ahead. I am Sreya Sarkar, the nonfiction editor at the Antonym. The Antonym magazine believes that the world speaks in many ways and in multiple languages. So it aims at creating a globally aware literary space that can lend voice to experiences and expressions of diverse cultures. Each month, the magazine chooses a special topic for its front and center section. For the month of April, the Antonym is focusing on Indian science fiction. Today, we have with us three wonderful panelists. We have Subodh Jawadekar. He is a renowned science and science fiction writer in Marathi. He has authored 16 books, edited 2, and co-authored 1 in Marathi and English. His stories and books have been translated into English, many Indian and a few European languages. He has earned more than 15 prestigious awards. He is a chemical engineer from IIT Bombay and has served in chemical industry for 37 years. He lives in Mumbai and enjoys reading, music, and traveling. Welcome, Subodhji.
Thank you.
We have with us Dipen Bhattacharya. He has published 6 works of fiction in Bengali, 3 novels, and 3 short story collections. He was raised in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and now resides in Southern California. The social dynamics of imagined future societies interwoven with scientific principles feature in his work, often set in Bengal. He holds a PhD in astrophysics. Welcome, Dipenda.
Thank you, Sreya. Good to be here.
We also have with us Gautam Shenoy with us. He is a science fiction and fantasy enthusiast and a science fiction columnist and critic. He is the writer of India's longest running weekly science fiction column in India, New Worlds Weekly for Factor Daily, as well as the Spec Fix column for Bangalore Mirror. He has been part of the science fiction track at Bangalore Literature Festival and Sri Lanka Comic Con, and is also the curator and co-host of HasGeek Science Fiction Book Club. He's also an advertising and marketing professional with over 21 years of experience in the field. Welcome, Shenoy.
Thank you.
Now, as we know that globally science fiction is going through an era of rapid change and expansion. And as a genre, it has become much more visible over the last decade or so. It has transformed from a nerdy subgenre dominated by pulp writers and amateur scientists and philosophers to include a more divergent, a much more vibrant community of writers to accommodate the choices of a wider audience. We are seeing a lot of writing right now, which is based in the news at the moment, like climate change, genetic manipulation, and we're also seeing stories about authoritarian governments and economic inequity. Now, while science fiction has been rooted in the present, and the kind of stories these have been around for decades, there seems to be, I would say, an added urgency at the moment. And of course, recently the pandemic has further made us think more about connectivity and what community means, and that has increased the demand and opened up the market to new material from all over the world. Also, the time, with time, who is telling the story? That bracket has expanded. There are more women that have entered the field. There is a better representation of the marginalized or underrepresented groups, and they are helping new audiences understand the concepts of prejudice and privilege better. Likewise, Indian science fiction has also come a long way. The genre has existed in the Indian subcontinent for more than 150 years, but recently it's seeing an explosion of experimental writings. Now, there are some commonalities found in the genre around the world, but at the same time, I think each country and region brings with it its own flavor and tonality, which is distinct and rather unique. The broad goal of the Antonym panel discussion is to understand what is unique about Indian science fiction. Keeping that in mind, we have put together a pool of questions for our panelists. Now, first of all, before we get into the thick of it, perhaps it might be a good idea to look at the definition of what is Indian science fiction and what qualifies. It's a broad category. So if Dipenda, would you like to take up that question first, and then we could go around the panel?
Actually, thank you, Sreya. I'll just have to kind of confess at the very beginning that I might not be the specialist who can actually talk about Indian science fiction in general, but let me try to see, address it from a different point of view, because my knowledge about the history of Indian science fiction is very sparse.
Give us a bird's eye view. That would be great.
Right. So just to kind of get to that, of course, this would be my take on it, that a lot of stuff, of course, builds upon colonialism and experience of colonialism, and Indian science fiction, in some sense, if you talk about the modern science fiction, starts with the brush with English and other European nations who came to India. That would be one take on it. Recently, there are, of course, discussions about whether science fiction can be traced to epic, ideas of Mahabharata, Ramayana, things like that. So I'll just put that aside. I think that even in Antonym magazine, I mean, there was discussion about when the first Indian science fiction was written, and I think there was, it was written in English in about like 1840 or something like that in Bengal. And right after that, there were some Bengali science fictions which were written. The first ones were actually anti-colonial, those fictions had anti-colonial ideas. And then later on, the science fiction that we see, at least from the Bengali science fiction history, that it actually veered away from it. And the idea of a hero scientist or engineer came forth. So which is really interesting in some sense, that because the seed was initially anti-colonial ideas, but eventually as the Bengal Renaissance actually progressed, I think that the thrust of it actually changed quite a bit. So, but I will just stop right there, because this would be the very beginning of Indian science fiction as far as I know. Thank you.
Subodh ji, would you like to take up the question?
Yes. First of all, Shreya, it was an excellent idea to start with the definition of science fiction. If you try to find out on Wikipedia, there are as many as 39 definitions of science fiction. Although they are differing from one another to some extent, they have got number of things in common. And taken together, they provide an excellent document what science fiction should have and must not have. And in these definitions, there are stalwarts like Asimov and Arthur Clarke and Campbell, and you name and he is there. But what I like most is Robert Heinlein's definition, because he has not defined science fiction in the usual way. He has defined it, he has provided a sort of checklist. And coming from an engineering background, I am always happy with a checklist. In that, he has mentioned 5 things actually, what should be there in science fiction. Out of that, 3 are most important. So I will cover only these 3. And let us see whether Marathi science fiction, how does it answer to these criteria what he has defined. The first criteria is, he says that the science fiction should not be here and now. That means it should be somewhat different than today's science and technology. If there should be some invention or something new, it may or may not happen in space. It can happen on Earth, but if it happens on Earth, something must have been changed. Our lifestyle must have been changed. Our way of thinking must have been changed. There should be some change. That is the first criteria. Then he says that the problem itself or the plot should be human. In other words, the story should not be that of science, but should be that of human beings. It's although the advancement of science has uh, generated that situation, it is how these men and women, they are answering to this challenge. That is what the story should tell. And then, of course, the third is that the established facts should not be violated. It should not violate what is known to be known. That means, for example, you should not show that a spaceship is traveling with speed greater than speed of light. And if you do, in that case, there should be sufficient explanation in the story itself. For example, if it is traveling faster than the speed of light, then you should say that it is traveling in hyperspace, and that's how it is. So it should be made plausible so that the reader should be convinced that what you are talking is sense. And as Marathi science fiction is considered, I would say almost all Marathi science fiction, they abide by the first criteria of not being here and now. It is slightly extrapolated in future. About the human problems, I would say 50% of Marathi science fiction is following that rule. It is about human beings, not about science. And the third one is that established facts should not be violated. I would say almost all Marathi science fiction, they do not violate this, what is known to be known, what is established here.
Shenoy, I would go to you. I know that, Indian science fiction scene has exploded and so much is happening right now. It has evolved as a concept as well. So it would be great if you could also fill in, on how the definition has changed and what it includes right now.
To a large extent, I agree with what Mr. Javadekar said. But even then, to define science fiction is very difficult. It's much easier to define it by what it does not have. It does not have fantastical elements and all of those things. Because, for example, if you look at, which is considered one of the first science fiction stories in India, which is whether it's Kailash Chandra Dutt's, sort of alternate history and all of those things, right? There's no technology there. Or even if you take Jagdish Chandra Bose's Runaway Cyclone, it's there in the now. It's just about, using a hair oil to dissipate a cyclone. That way, so rather than get into definitions of what it is, I think we should just proceed with these stories and all of those. For example, if you look at feminist science fiction, one of the earliest examples anywhere in the world is Begum Rokeya Hossain's Sultana's Dream, right? And that's a dream narrative, right? And there's not, it's not enabled by technology per se. While Ladyland does have technology, it's not, the story per se is not propelled by technology. So I wouldn't go too much into the definition of science fiction, but rather speak of what is Indian, right? Because the problems of defining science fiction is true in India as well as everywhere else, right? So to me, Indian science fiction would be science fiction written by Indians, which speaks to our culture, which is available to us, and written by people who've been here, lived here at some point in time. And the reason I make this very clear is that India-inspired science fiction or India-inspired SF is now like really, really big, and you see lots of people laying claim to be writing Indian science fiction without, having any sort of rootedness to this. So that to me, I would say, what Indian science fiction to me stands for. And yes, has it evolved? Yes, it's evolved. The scope is a lot more global now. Especially in English, because for the longest time what happened was that science fiction in India was kept alive in our regional languages, right? And when we talk about this global renaissance, it usually refers to the science fiction in English, which has been few and far between, and it's only over the turn of the century that it sort of started expanding and sort of exploded in the last few years. But what that sort of ignores is the fact that our authors are authors in Marathi, authors in Bengali, in Kannada, in Assamese, in Hindi have been keeping the genre alive. And because of the nature of the beast, because of the language barrier and all, it isn't spoken of that much, and it just sort of gets siloed. So what I see happening, because you asked me what are the changes that are happening, it is that the focus is that much more on the stories that our people have written. There's more of a focus to see what our Bengali or our Marathi or Kannada or Tamil writers have written, and to bring that out into the mainstream, right? So that it's accessible to all. So in that sense also, we cannot say that India is one monolith. So we run across problems of definition everywhere.
Yes, I'm sure. And it's going to further evolve with time. That sails us beautifully into the second question, and perhaps I can fudge the first and the second and third together. Yes, so right now, the present time, it is being called the golden age of science fiction in India. And you just mentioned, Shenoy, that there has been a lot of English writing in this genre, a lot of Indians writing in English. What would be interesting is to understand that what happened. I mean, has there been a national or international political changes that brought about this sudden explosion of writing in English? And at the same time, there are these regional languages that is producing prolifically, literature in this genre. So how does that play into each other, and how has that shaped and influenced this evolution? What you would consider are the main reasons or the main factors that has affected this evolution or change? Is it political? Is it technology? Is technology a reason why things have changed so much in the form of expression? They're more hybrid writing now. So what's happening there? Shenoy, would you like to take that question up first?
Yeah, sure. Since you put it in the context of English first, so let me just tackle that first. It's not so much to do with political changes as much as it's to do with access and the sort of willingness of publishers to invest in this genre. Right? In India, especially, where the same publisher, see, in the West, for example, you have science fiction imprints, specialized imprints like a Golan's or a Tor, which are specialized imprints of larger publishing houses which focus on a particular genre. In India, we don't have that. So the same publisher who publishes general fiction, non-fiction, history also publishes science fiction. And in India, it was considered that there isn't much of a readership. Now, with the coming of the internet and with people sort of coming together as readers and making their what shall we say, interests felt about what they read and all that, this thing, there was a need that, okay, maybe there is a readership here, and that goes beyond just an Asimov or a Clarke or a Heinlein. Right. I mean, once upon a time, if you walked into a science fiction section of a bookstore, you would probably see only Asimov, Heinlein, Clarke, Philip K. Dick, maybe one or two Ursula Le Guin's, right, and some SF masterworks. But now it's exploded, and there's a huge Indian thing. So it comes down to access. The other thing that's also, so the publishers have also seen that, hey, listen, there is a readership for this. And the classic example for this, for example, and how this works is earlier this year, one of the better Indian science fiction books published in India was Samit Basu's Chosen Spirits, which is set in the late 2020s. It's an extrapolation of our technologies, right, and how social media and influencers and surveillance and pollution is going to, and climate change is affecting us and all of that. Now, that got shortlisted for the JCB prize, which is India's richest literary prize. And usually these prizes are only looked at, are only shortlist, quote unquote, literary fiction, right? Now, Chosen Spirits was literary and it was science fiction. So now when that happens and when people talk about it, there's that, positive feedback mechanism, and that's what has been happening. That's what has been happening. Lavanya Lakshminarayan, for example, one of the better books of 2020 anywhere in the world is a collection called Analog Virtual, which is set in a slightly distant future in which nation states have collapsed and cities have been privatized. And this is set in a place called Apex City, which used to be called Bangalore. Now, this book, for example, was recommended by Locus, was added in the Locus recommended list, which is read worldwide. Now, the Locus recommended list every year is looked at as a sort of a base for the Hugos and the Nebulas and all of those, right? Now, Chosen Spirits as well as Analog Virtual was there. So that in itself feeds on itself. So it's a question of access. The other place where Indian science fiction has been sort of flowering, especially in English, is foreign publications like Strange Horizons, Clark's World, Uncanny, and all these magazines, right? And that has been enabled by the internet and a global audience. It's just that Indian science fiction was always there and it was always good. But with the opening up of the world and the internet and everybody looking to say that, okay, listen, we're tired of hearing the same boring stories from old white men from the early to mid 20th century. I mean, no shade on them, all excellent, all foundational, all great. But we need different stories. We need stories that come from a different sort of, a literary ancestor. We need to, speak more about our own culture. Plus, we need to look at many different cultures than the usual Anglophone Eurocentric. And that all of these sort of sociological strains, this access via the internet have all sort of come together and sort of, right time, right place kind of a thing, which is why we see this sort of global renaissance.
That was great. Yeah, so you also bring up this this concept, this factor of culture, how each region, each country has its own exclusive culture, and people want to hear, like at the global level, they want to hear different stories, especially set in different countries, because it adds something new, something that they have not heard of before, gives it more diversity. Here's Subodhji, I would like to ask you, how things have changed, because you have been around for a long time writing in this genre. You've written so much. Also, your book, Akant, it talks about the Bhopal gas tragedy. Here, so wonderfully, you have married your background in chemical engineering, and you have brought out this problem, a human problem that we were seeing. And, it has become a book. So, do you think that is it a political book? Do you think political changes matter? It has touched, affected the genre. When people are talking and making stories, writing stories, somewhere perhaps it seeps in, and also as well as the cultural factor that Shenoy talks about. How does that play into, how this genre has been rolling out in India?
I will restrict myself to Marathi science fiction as far as the history of science fiction is concerned in Marathi. If I can run down in just 3-4 minutes how the Marathi science fiction has changed, and then towards the end I will talk about whether there is something like Indian science fiction. Whether Indian science fiction, does it mean the science fiction written by Indian authors, or does it mean something else? So first of all, in a very short, brief history of Marathi science fiction, it started in 1900, and strangely, it did not. The first print of science fiction was not in Maharashtra, but was in Trivandrum in Kerala, because one Mr. Krishnaji Athavale, he has started publishing Jules Verne's From Earth to Moon novel, and he started printing it in Marathi, but in Trivandrum. Then next 50 years, there were some stories written by Vaman Malhar Joshi or Shriba Ranade. They were not exactly science fiction. So first 50 years, there was not much of science fiction. Then next 20 years, there were stories, but they were mostly translations or adaptations by authors like Bhara Bhagwat and Dharap and Khambete and things others. The actual change took place in 1970s. Naralekar, he started writing science fiction. Up to that time, science fiction was considered as some child stuff. It was not considered seriously at all. And in when 1970, Jayan Naralekar started writing science fiction. It has changed because of a person like Jayan Naralekar's stature. If he writes science fiction, it must be taken seriously. So it was being taken seriously. Then but one thing was there, Jayan Naralekar considered science fiction as a vehicle for popularization of science.
Interesting to hear about Jayan Naralekar. I heard about that he's, because he's quite famous in the field of physics and astronomy.
I know that you have been, very involved with the environmental movement in Bangladesh. And it would be interesting to see how, that has influenced your interest in the genre. And the books that you've written, there is a marrying of the two, of the present, the reality, and the science. So, it would be great if you could tell us a bit about your experience and how you think the genre has evolved.
Anyway, I was very glad to hear Shenoyji's, he mentioned Kailash Chandra Datta and Jagadish Bose, but I was really surprised that he mentioned Rokeya Begum's Sultana's Dream, because that's really something that's not really known outside. I'm very, very pleased. So just again, as Subodhji was saying about Marathi science fiction, I can say only a little bit about Bengali science fiction, and maybe it goes back to maybe 1950s or 60s, because that's when it kind of got a second life in some sense with, as Shreya, you would know, with Satyajit Ray's writing and Premendra Mitra's writing. I think those are the two stalwarts who actually, I grew up reading Premendra Mitra, and I was a fan of him, of course. Now, if you ask me among these two, I would actually put Premendra Mitra over Satyajit Ray by a mile in some sense, only because he, going back to what our panelists were saying, that in terms of the cultural aspect of it, he has set this up in a place in Kolkata, which is very real. And from that, he extrapolates it to the world, that in a small adda, with the 3-4 people sitting together, but contemplating the world. But let me come back to the Bangladesh science fiction in some sense. So there is as you know, that there was a major milestone in the history of Bangladesh's 1971 war. And that actually, after the war, there was a lot of there's a resurgence, or I would say even the new ideas came after the war, and we got several writers among them. And one of them was, his name is Humayun Ahmed, who is really, as you know, that he was the best-selling author who has passed away a few years ago. And just like anybody else, like Sunil Gangopadhyay, Shishindu Mukhopadhyay, he was famous because of his regular writing, literary writing. But then, as a tradition of Bengal always is, that these famous writers always will write something for either the Puja Shankha, Durga Puja issue, or Eid issue. And they would have that separate tendency. And Humayun Ahmed became quite popular. And I would think that, even though, as I said, that it may not be the best science fiction, but he was responsible for introducing the habit of reading, I must say, not even introducing science or anything, in Bangladesh, actually. And his brother, younger brother, is quite an astute writer also, and he's a professor at university. Going back to my work a little bit, again, 1971 actually influenced us so much that that's like one of my work which is called Ditar Ghuri, Dita's Watch, actually set in 1971, but it doesn't say anything about the that which army or against which the war is going on. But instead of Pakistani army, it is an army which has occupied the flatland, and their ideology was that they would not allow any timekeeping. So they would come and destroy all the watches, and the people on the flatland, they are, you know, they were good watchmakers and things like that. So the army which has occupied the land would destroy all the watches and would kill off all the watchmakers. And basically it goes from there on. And the only reason I'm talking about it is that how 1971 has influenced us. And the story has 3 different endings where the watchmakers eventually win, and in another scenario, the watchmaker wins but eventually loses. And the third scenario was they lose the war altogether. But it uses an idea of basically quantum multi-level universe where these outcomes happen in 3 different universes. And going back to what you said about environmental thing, I have, again, I shouldn't talk about myself, but the only reason I'm saying this, that give you a little bit of idea where the tendency is. And it is set up 2000 years from now, and where the entire land has been submerged underwater. And, you know, this is, this will happen actually, eventually. And the world, again, the idea that many science fiction uses that there are no countries and things like that. And human beings are, their brains are being copied and kept in storages, and there is no death. And you cannot die until you are 200 years old. And if you want to die, you have to have a special permission from the world authorities. And it goes from there, actually. And then there is a terrorist organization which wants to destroy the brain bank and things like that, and that type of conflict in the society. So what I'm trying to say here is that, you know, just like Ursula Guin, and Shenoy mentioned about Ursula Guin, one of my favorite writers, and she brings, after this idea of just have the pure science, and you know, you see this Margaret Atwood's and other writing that this transition from that to the social sciences and how we can use that. We are just at that juncture. I think that, you know, even Indian science fiction, even the other ones, that we're just jumping over from that level, from pure science to having the social sciences mixed in right there. I'll just say one more thing about it. One of the problems with writing in Bengali is, of course, what is the language that you're going to use, and what is the technological term that you're going to use. And it depends very much on where your society is. That's why it's very difficult to write in native languages. And so if you look at, like, you would know that Li Qin, for example, in the Chinese science fictions, how it has come up in recent years, because China has advanced so much in technology, they can take that ideas and put that in the science fiction without any hesitancy. When I'm writing it, let me just put it, I will put Sreya and Shenoy in a spacecraft and send them at a close to speed of light to the nearest star. And then you have to always ask that, is it feasible to have these Indian people in traveling in these things? So there, once you get this problem, and in Bangladesh it's even worse, actually, right? So you have to step back and make it believable. And you have to use different techniques to make it believable, because I have these characters, and what techniques do I use to make it a believable science fiction, which would be laughable in some ways. I'll stop right there. Thank you.
In regional languages, science fiction writing has been around for ages, for a long, long time.
Yes.
Has that also seen some evolution? What are the new trends that you see now versus when people first started reading and writing science fiction?
Now this next generation, which people who are writing in Marathi last 20 years, there are some changes. I would say that they are not the typical stories of space travel and parallel universe, but there are more stories about biology, about neuroscience, and the stories have become shorter. The style has changed, and I would say that these are the changes in the new generation which is writing science fiction nowadays.
Okay, thank
I
you.
mean, to add on to that, that is the other thing that wanted to talk about science fiction, because we were talking about definitions. Because when say it should not break, it should follow what we know scientifically. That definition, when you say, usually people only mean physics. If you noticed, when they say it should not break any, it should follow science as we know it. It's usually physics, and that's a very hard SF, old-fashioned thing to go. And slowly now, if you look at it, it's the social sciences that are coming up. It's the neurosciences. People, like the science in Ursula Le Guin was anthropology, or in N.K. Jemison's trilogy was geology. There is now room for other sciences as well, and not just physics. So, like you were saying, it's not just space travel anymore. It's more, uh, you know, societal. It's more here and now in that sense.
Right.
Yeah,
To that, Sreya, I just want to add that
Please.
A lot of things depend on the political situation of the country. So for example, I mentioned that after 71, there was a kind of a resurgence or just evolution of science fiction in Bangladesh. But I would say that in recent years, it has taken a back step in some ways. What we're talking about going into the social sciences, there are certain things that I would say it regressed. It all depends on how the political and social situation of the country is. And in some ways, there are restrictions that sometimes the writers feel that what they can write and what they can publish. And especially if it involves religion, that's a major problem. And so I would say sometimes that it actually kind of nips in the bud some of the the creativity that you might have, and you want to express it. So you have to kind of couch it in different languages or change the entire premise. So just as I'm saying that I was mentioning about this story, which is set 2000 years from now, when there are no countries, and I would not be able to write there are no religions either, actually. So even that particular sentence can't be written right there, and you have to be very specific about it. So what I was saying that, say, if the entire country goes through a certain kind of change, it also gets reflected on the writer's mind also, and it sometimes it doesn't progress as we want it to go forward.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I would like to, right now, I think talking about mythology and myth is again an area which we are seeing a lot of it right now. It has come back in some form. Would any of you want to take that question up? Why do you think I mean, maybe the reason is that the governments in many countries have become more authoritarian, that people are dipping back into the history and picking up all those stories and epics that were forgotten. And is that, in a way of getting back science fiction into the fold? Maybe a different way of getting it in the fold. But do you think that is one of the reasons why mythology has and folklores have come back in such a big way?
Yes, just as much as everyone is looking back to this hoary past, this glorious past, right? And where we've had speakers at science congresses talking about how genetics existed, and cloning existed, and we had these flying vehicles and all of those things. So if that's the definition of science, then yes, mythology is science fiction, right? But that's not the way we are taught to look at science. Science needs evidence, science needs proof. right? And so in that sense, I wouldn't consider it's fantastic literature. It's the literature of the fantastic, no doubt. It's highly imaginative, no doubt. But would I call it science fiction? I wouldn't. Right? It's clearly mythology. Now, what we have currently today are two strains of this going around. One, which is what I call mythsploitation, right? Where you tired Ramayana remixes, Mahabharata fanfic, the same stories retold with little masala here and there, right? Mythsploitation. Market is there for that. That's the general way of going. We will write, it'll get published, it'll get sold, very well. But you can't dismiss all myth-focused ones. There are what I call mythofiction, which are good retellings or stories, for example, which try to look at our myths from, and I love myths. I grew up on Amar Chitrakatha, right? So that was my first exposure to the literature of the fantastic. Now, so on the other spectrum from mythsploitation is good mythofiction as well, which tries to sort of see that in a fictional context, can I give it a scientific basis. For example, there was this book by Krishnavade called Bees, right? Which is about, I mean, we've heard about werewolves. This book is about Saimhas, which is about were-tigers, right? And in which she traces that this is a species of she names the species, the name of the species escapes me now, and how that how they were descended from Narasimha, how they were the result of an experiment, how they've integrated with human society. So it's a different perspective, or trying to look at the whole Narasimha story and introducing were-tigers in a different in an interesting way, right? So that kind of good mythofiction also exists. And then the other part of the mythofiction that exists now is most of the stories that we see are a product of their time. So which means patriarchy, sexism is all baked into those stories, right? So a lot of the retellings that are happening, the good ones that are happening, are sort of reclaiming and recasting them from a whole new perspective, right? There's this anthology of feminist SF, which is it contains both science fiction and fantasy and everything in between. It's called Magical Women, edited by Sukanya Venkatraghavan. It's an anthology of, I think, about 17 or 18 stories, in which and it's an all women, I think the first in this part of the world, an all women feminist anthology, which looks at while some of them are science fiction, a lot of them are retellings of myth, which sort of look at it from different perspective. Like, for example, one of my favorite stories from that is Nikita Deshpande's The Girl Who Haunted Death. We're very familiar with the story of Savitri and Satyavan, how Savitri, went behind Yama and he let Satyavan come back to life because Savitri is, the paragon of wifely virtue and all of those. And this gives it a completely different spin. It takes it into a different dimension where, she chases him via various dimensions and all of those things. And then Yama takes on many forms. Savitri takes on many forms. It's not the Savitri that we know. It's a very unfamiliar Savitri, right? Recently in Strange Horizons, there was this story called The Demon Sage's Daughter by Varsha Dinesh. And it's the story of Kacha and Devyani. I mean, we all know the story. Kacha comes to Shukracharya to learn the mantra, to bring the Devas back to life. They kill him and feed him to Shukracharya. Shukracharya is sort of forced to teach him to him, so that when Kacha comes out of Shukracharya's stomach, he revives Shukracharya. And and Devyani, who's Shukracharya's daughter, falls in love with Kacha. And it's always been either Kacha's story or Shukracharya. It's never been Devyani's story. So this story is told from Devyani's perspective and how she makes the story her own, right? So like I said, there's this one strain of mythsploitation which is just sort of factory model, assembly line, tired tropes, bad remixes, which are being, sort of classic beach reads. By that, I mean the kind of book that you read in the beach and leave it behind there, right? And not take it back with you. So you read it, you forget it, it's there to feed into the current zeitgeist. But on the other hand, there are these other stories as well, which sort of question our past, make us look at it in a different light, right? That approach it from the perspective of equality or feminism, and sort of highlight all these things. So that according to me is the sort of state of play when it comes to mythology in India. And like I said, there's nothing being brave about it. I mean, let's admit it, right? Science fiction has always been political. It has always been political.
With Sreya's
Right.
permission, can I ask Shenoy, do you, in that Magical Women anthology, was there any Bengali women writer? Do you remember? I don't know whether you would remember.
I do not. I
Yeah.
don't think so. I don't think so.
The reason why I asked is this, that because again, it goes back to Rokeya Begum, like Sultana's Dream, which is really written by a woman. And then there was no women representation in Bengali science fiction. And really interesting that Satyajit Ray, who had created this character, Professor Shonku, he had no women character in any of his writing, by the way. Not only that, they were not given any role, they were just absent. And the same with Pramendra Mitra and things like that. And if you look at even recent Bengali writing, there was no women writer at all, actually. I mean, in some ways, I think that this is also, somehow when the women come in and write science fiction and things like that, or something like this, it also talks about where the society stands at this point of time. That was my...
I think more recently...
in current English writing, there are a lot of Bengali women writers.
In English writing, I see.
Isn't Mimi Mondol, she's got a prize also, some award.
No, not that. She was nominated. She was nominated for co-editing on anthology.
But this is in English, though, right?
It is in English.
Yeah,
it is in English.
Yeah.
I mean, there's Mimi Mondol. There's Nibedita Sen. Nibedita Sen has also been nominated. There's Ayana Dutt, who's also Bengali. So and of course Sukanya Datta. So she's written a lot of science fiction. She again is a scientist herself. She's written a lot of science fiction, but again in English. So, but I'm pretty sure that there are women writing in Bengali now as well. I mean, for that matter, even Begum Rokeya Hossain wrote Sultana's Dream in English. That's her only writing in English.
That's true. Right. That's true.
Right. That's fascinating. Yeah. So much going on right now. So, one thing that comes up time and again is that there is this tradition of writing English science fiction in India. And there is also this tradition of the different languages, the vernaculars. For a long time in the science fiction magazines, short stories have come out. And they have been, people have a lot of affection for them. There has been a history of that. Do you see that regional magazines, science fiction magazines, are still around? Are they still popular? Subodhji, what do you see?
I would say that in Marathi, there is no science fiction magazine which is dedicated to science fiction. There never had been any. There are some magazines which predominantly cover science fiction. They were there like Srushti Jnana and Jnana Vikas and Vignan something. I forgot the name. But there are some. But as far as, there is no magazine which is fully dedicated to science fiction. There are magazines which print science fiction. There is a tradition in Maharashtra that in Diwali they take out lots of issues. At least 300 to 400 issues come out. Now last year, because of Corona, they were only restricted to 100 or so, but still. Otherwise, about 300 to 400 issues come out in Diwali, and there are about 1,000 to 1,200 stories. out of that, I would say about 30 to 40%, so not 30 to 40 stories, that means make about 3 to 4% are science fiction. And as far as women science fiction writers are concerned, I would say 30% of science fiction writers are women in Marathi. And there was a question whether these magazines glued together the science fiction enthusiasts and science fiction writers. I would say no, not much, because they didn't have much influence. On the contrary, now there are small groups which have formed. They write and share their stories with each other and criticize and find out what is the best. Sometimes they exchange titles, and these sort of activities are going on. But as far as magazines are concerned, they have not contributed much specifically to science fiction in Marathi.
I have a
I
question.
think in that, Dipen ji, please.
Sorry, because I know that Marathi theater scene, the drama and things like that, very developed, well developed. Is there any science fiction that has been dramatized, or is there a movie that came out?
No movie has come out. There were a few movies which claimed that they are science fiction, but they were very trash, and I won't call them as science fiction movies. But there are some theater, and there are some one-act play which, based on stories in science fiction, they take out a competition. And last year, this competition was participated by as many as 20 groups. They presented dramas, only one-act dramas based on science fiction stories. And there were as many as 20. And when we discussed about Lakshman Londhe is the name of science fiction writer. His story, unfortunately, he is not there with us now. He expired about 5 years back. But his story, the act based on his story, it came out to be the first in that activities there. Yeah.
Right. So that brings me to the other question, which is related, which is, what role do you think translation will play in popularizing regional science fiction work of literature? And I know that there has been, a bit of translation going on. I talked to Suparno Banerjee last week, and he gave me a list of good translations. But do you think that would add a new dimension to Indian science fiction if translations became more popular?
Certainly, I would say yes, because Shenoy gave an example of It Happened Tomorrow. Now, It Happened Tomorrow, the stories from It Happened Tomorrow has been translated into French, German, and Italian, and a few other European languages, sometimes even without the knowledge and without the permission of the author, but they have been translated, and we know that they have appeared in some magazines in Europe. And without those being translated into English, there was no hope, no chance that they would have been, they would have reached this European audience at all. So translators have excellent, very big role to play in popularizing and reaching out outside India.
Shenoy, would you like to add something to that?
Yes, I mean, it goes without saying, like, this was a point that I made earlier on, that, the language barrier gets in the way when we talk about, Indian science fiction, because like science fiction in Marathi is as Indian as the science fiction in Kannada. But a Maharashtrian cannot read Kannada. Okay, I can perhaps understand because my mother tongue is Konkani, so I can, and I know Devanagari, and I attempt Marathi, right? So translations, okay, leave apart the fact that you can then translate it into French and into, or Spanish or whatever, Portuguese or whatever language that you think. when you translate it into English, what it immediately does is then it can get translated into other Indian languages, because the chances are more, right, that you'll hardly find probably very few people who are very well versed in Kannada and Assamese to translate between the two. But if it's there in English, then it becomes easier to translate into this thing. So for me, translation is a big bridge. Now, forget the part about taking it to the world, so that our own people can read our stories. Because I would love to read stories which are set in Bengal, which are in Bengali, right? Because I would relate more to that than something that's set in Portugal. A Portuguese guy would definitely, I can say, not relate more to a Bengali story than I would. So to me, it's about our own stories written by our own people being made access to us ourselves, right? And which is where to go back to your question about magazines, I think Bengal is blessed, and Bengalis are blessed in that sense, because that perhaps is the only the culture that had science fiction magazines, with Fantastic and Ashcharya, and thanks to Adrish Bardhan in those days, there were dedicated science fiction magazines. Whereas, like Subodh ji said, it's the same in Kannada. You have your mainstream magazines like Sudha and Taranga and Mayura, which also carried, they carried social stories to do with social issues and dowry and all. They also carried stories of science fiction stories. It was not the same in Bengal. And as things stand, Bengal is still the only state to have a dedicated science fiction magazine. It's called Kalpa Biswa. It's edited by Deep Ghosh, right? And they bring out, they don't just publish new stories, they also bring print novels. They're also a publisher, right? So in that sense, and I've seen how those when I've spoken to Deep, and I've seen how Kalpa Biswa and their publications have helped build a sort of community, right, of Bengali readers from across the world, because it's online across the world. So yes,
Right.
it does help have a magazine.
Which kind of brings me to the other question, which was a part of this pool of questions, which is that I think science fiction magazines play a role not only in popularizing writings, new writings and writers, but also the readers. They find themselves in a community where they can exchange what they have read, what's coming up, and you play a very unique role here, Shenoy, in filling that gap. I would say nationally, right? Because a lot of people read your blogs, your writings, your articles in the magazines, and they find out what's most recent and what's exciting in this field. So would you like to talk about what you are doing? Because I think it's educative to a lot of people who are new, youngsters, as well as enthusiasts who have been doing this for such a long time, just to understand the trend as well.
Yeah, so I'm just glad that I'm lucky enough and fortunate enough to be in a position where people read what I write, and that I can talk more about this genre that I love. And it's not that there isn't a readership. It's just a question of knowledge, right? Not so much now, but I used to keep hearing, oh, there's no such, is there Indian science fiction? But when somebody asked me, is there Indian science fiction, or somebody said, oh, there isn't any science fiction in India, to me, the way I interpreted it was, I don't know about science fiction in India. That's what I wanted to do, when Factor Daily approached me for my column, which ran for, more than 3 years. The fact that, hey, listen, there's this gap, right? Your mainstream publications don't know about science fiction because they think it's very geeky, or it's not worth their time. It's a very small audience and all. My thing was that, no, there is a readership. It's just a question of telling people that these books exist, right? In most of the time, unless you are a celebrity or whatever it is, in Indian publishing, how it works, a book gets published. They send unsolicited books to the publications who don't bother. It goes to the bookstores and is forgotten. It's half the time it's on the author to talk about it, and how much can one person do? So that's what I thought I would do, sort of not just tell our people about the history of Indian science fiction, that, hey, listen, it's not new, it's not 5 years old or 6 years old, it's more than that, it's a century and a half. and we have many firsts to our name. And the fact that, okay, that there are all these great books coming up, please go out and read. Right. So in that, so I was part this year, I was part of the Global Locus panel as well to choose the recommended list, and also it is great honor. Like, for example, since we are talking about the history of science fiction, one small instance I will give you. I'm sure some of you may have heard of Shivaram Karanth, Kota Shivaram Karanth. He's a Diggaj, a legendary writer. He's a Jnanpith Award winner, right? His books have been turned into some amazing social dramas and hard-hitting films. Now, what many people don't know is that in 1928, right, 10 years before the beginning of the Western US golden age of science fiction, in 1928, Shivaram Karanth wrote a story called Pashubala, which is a science fiction story. In 1928, it was a story of a bunch of explorers, inventors, sort of quarantining themselves or cloistering themselves in an island, building an interstellar spaceship and traveling to Mercury and meeting the aliens there. So it was a novel of interplanetary interstellar travel. It was an alien first contact story. And in that, he explains even how the plane generates its own energy to fly to Mercury. He talks about this little device which allows, he called it Tejo Bhashaka, which allows for instantaneous communication between planets, and it uses light. And this was like 60 years before Ursula Le Guin came up with the Ansible, right? And this was him writing in 1928. Now, not many people know this because it was in Kannada, and there's nobody, who's talking about this in the mainstream thing, right? So if I can bring such things out, right, and help our own people appreciate the history of this genre and know about all the good books there are, right? Mission accomplished. Yeah. And it's been going good so far, because lots of people do tell me, hey, listen, I didn't know this happened. I didn't know this book existed. Right. Right. I don't know. Okay. This is also there in Indian science fiction. Yes, it's there. I mean, it's not a lot of it, but it's there.
Yeah, thank you, Shenoy. That was great. Now, Dipenda, I would like to go to you with a question that kind of bridges this, from here to the future. What do you think, how do you think Indian science fiction is being perceived right now globally? And what, according to you, is the future for Indian science fiction at the more global platform?
Well, it's kind of, I was, listening to both Shenoy and Subodh in some sense. As you know, Shreya, it's really interesting coming from Bangladesh. We have a all completely different perspective, of course, because you have only one language with Bengali. And then when you're in India, you really have to bridge all these languages. And when it's really interesting, Shreya, I don't know whether you remember we had a panel discussion a few months back, and I always said that to me, and in Indian education system, there should be a 4-language system. And the 4-language system is that if you're a non-Hindi speaker, you should learn Hindi and your regional language, whatever, and English, of course. So that's 3 already. But besides that, you should be forced to learn another Indian language. And
I do remember that, yes.
Talking about Assamese and Kannada. And I always thought that was really unfortunate that an Indian would know more about whatever Ursula Guin or Jules Verne or something, but would not know, like Sibram Kant, for example, just to give you an example as such. So, but I'll come back to your question in a second. I'll talk about the periodicals. And also, Shenoy mentioned about Bengal was blessed with it. And he mentioned Adrish Bardhan, Rahasya, fantastic magazine, and Kalpo Bisho. By the way, Shenoy, last year when I was in Kolkata, Deep Ghosh and Sandipan Ganguly and other came to my sister lives in Kolkata, and they took an interview of me, and it was published in Kalpo Bisho. I have a couple of—
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, so they were very nice. And I'm in touch with them regularly, with Deep and Sandipan. And they published a couple of stories of mine also in Kalpo Bisho. Very, very excellent magazine to, say the least.
Absolutely wonderful stuff.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful, right? It just, I was just talking to you, I was thinking that maybe some of your stuff should be translated. You should write for them in some sense, and there are translators there, and they can do this very easily. And you should have a regular column. I should tell them to have the regular column. That's something I should remind them, right? So in going back to, I'll come back to your question in a second, Sreya. And in Bangladesh right now, I write for a regular science column called Bigyan Chinta. It comes out of Prothom Alo, which is really the leading language in Dhaka. And they sometimes ask science fiction from me also. So sometimes I would give them science fiction. So I'm just saying that type of, even though there is no dedicated science fiction magazine in Dhaka, but they have other science magazines and they publish regular science fictions in them in some ways. So that works out. I'm just kind of, what I'm trying to say is that India is such a complicated place. And when you want to jumpstart from here and go to the future, and I always thought that the science fiction has a societal responsibility, or they can actually do a lot of things that we mentioned over here, that there are some specific societal issues that come from, like, for example, gender, selection or something like that, and all the caste problem. There's a wonderful, I think, opportunity to actually exploit this particular problem, you might say, that caste problem, whatever it is, in science fiction, how to take it to the next level and what you can do with it, right? And going back to what your question about the future, I think that we already mentioned about how the anthropology and sociology and economics coming into the forefold, but they should look at the Indian problems very, very keenly. And one problem is, of course, that science fiction writers try to avoid. I talked about the political problem, that when you talk about religion, when you talk about caste and gender, of course, and these things are complicated, and there are a lot of fertile grounds to address this, of course. Thank you.
Subodhji, what do you think is the future for Indian science fiction, and how do you think it's going to be perceived globally?
I would say Indian science fiction in general has a bright future, because people, although don't read books, reading has gone down, but reading on internet has gone up quite a lot. And science fiction, people read more and more. So Indian science fiction also has a bright chance of getting more readership.
Shenoy, would you like to add something here?
I think the future is bright. I think it's going to only exponentially increase as more and more people look to India for Indian stories written by Indians, right? Not quote unquote India inspired by some author who happened to spend a summer holiday in India, right? So it's going to happen. We're going to the nominations and all of that has been, not that we need recognition or validation, but it helps that our stories are as good as the ones made elsewhere or written elsewhere. The nominations and all have begun. We're knocking on the doors of the global stage. It's just a matter of time before those doors are broken down. I mean, like, for example, it's not as if, and I give this example often, it's not as if Chinese science fiction was born in 2014 when Cixin Liu won the Hugo, right? It was there for the longest time, and then it just took that one win to to take Chinese science fiction onto the global stage. And then people are like, hey, listen, there's a lot of stuff here, let's see what's happening. And currently science fiction from China is the best new thing, right? It's the hot new things. A lot, people like Chen Qifan or all of those Xia Jia, all of these people are being feted across the world. So just that you need that one tipping point for Indian science fiction. This is from a global perspective. From a domestic perspective also, I think with more translations, people taking up translations and all of that, we'll be able to read more and more stories. And given the fact that currently pop culture is dominated by science fiction, I see that more and more publishers, even in regional languages, looking to science fiction as a way of sort of, getting the pulse on the, getting on the reader's pulse,
Right.
so to speak. So good days ahead. Good days ahead.
This has been so eye-opening, really. I mean, we've tried to cover many different aspects, and it's endless. The aspects keep multiplying. The way it is unfolding right now. It's interesting how many books I have read growing up, not even realizing. I mean, I knew it was science fiction, but I was not mindful of it and how fascinating they were to me. And right now, I see Ishan also, my son also, reading, picking up new books and getting fascinated with that. I just think, there's this sense of wonder associated with this genre. And it appeals to just every age group. That's what makes it so special. Whether or not it could become mainstream or whether we want it to become mainstream, that's a different question. But overall, I think, this step in this new direction of this, literature becoming at least taking a step into mainstream, into the OTT platforms, to movies, the global scene. It's really encouraging. So thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful discussion. And I wish you all the best in your future endeavors. Keep writing, keep reading, and stay well. Thank you so much.
Okay.